Hello and welcome to Books at HSS, a podcast by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS in collaboration with Radio LUMS. For this podcast, we invite faculty at the department to talk about their books. And today we have with us Dr. Ali Raza, who is an associate professor of history, and we'll be discussing his book, Revolutionary Pasts, Communist Internationalism in Colonial India, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. The Pakistan edition of the book was published by Folio Books in 2021. Welcome, Ali, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So before we get into the book, could you tell us a little bit about your intellectual journey leading up to this project, how this project came into being?
Thank you. It's been a while since I wrote the book, and it's always wonderful to revisit it, so I'm grateful for the opportunity. I guess one way in which I will frame my answer is just to describe what is my larger project, my larger interest. And I'm interested by training, I am a South Asianist. I trained in South Asian history. And through my PhD, and even now, I'm very much interested in thinking about the horizon of decolonization in South Asia, and by extension, the global South and the formerly colonized world. I'm interested in the many dreams, ambitions, aspirations, and hopes that people had of this event that we call freedom, that we otherwise treat as an unequivocal good. And I'm interested of all those dreams and aspirations and perhaps even utopianisms that didn't quite materialize. Because as other scholars have also pointed out, we tend to think of the freedom that all these nation states attained, including Pakistan and India, as being the inevitable outcome of processes of struggles rather for national liberation, of decolonization itself. And part of what I'm interested in is the contingency of the moment, which is to say that I'm interested in all of those ideas really that people had, and expectations really that people had of a world that was free from colonial rule. And so for that reason, so that's one of the reasons why I became interested in communist thought and communist internationalism as a global project, and how it basically found root in South Asia too.
Great. So as you begin narrating this sort of journey or arc of communist internationalism in colonial India, you begin it with a chapter that's titled Travelers, Migrants, and Rebels. So could you tell us about, if it is a journey of sorts, and if it is a story of hopes and aspirations, it begins with these characters that you refer to as travelers, migrants, and rebels. So why this choice? What's going on?
That's a great question. So, the book is weaved through characters and individuals that I found in police and intelligence archives. These are people who come up as rebels, who come up as seditious figures, sometimes even as fanatics, who are single-mindedly driven to the destruction of the British Empire. At least that's the way that they're presented. And so they were very interesting characters to me. And so I also began following up on their own memoirs and what they had written about their lives. And so the story that I'm trying to sketch begins, roughly speaking, from just before the First World War, when there is a political organization that's founded in California, of all places, and British Columbia in Canada. And this is a party of Punjabi laborers who have been in the western kind of like coast of North America for a decade or two, and they initially went there as laborers, and owing to various experiences, including experiences with visceral racism, they found a political organization called the Ghadar Party, which at that time, and that's what I want to emphasize, which at the time when major political parties in India were calling for greater concessions, constitutional concessions, and basic autonomy, these guys were basically calling for a complete independence from British rule. And this is the year 1914. And so Starting from there, I trace characters who are either exiles or students or intellectuals or laborers who traverse the planet in various capacities and who, through their own trajectories, sometimes by accident, sometimes by political conviction, they decide to become rebels, who are devoted to overthrowing colonial rule in the subcontinent. And so it's a motley bag of characters. And so my attempt is to trace their journeys, their lives, as well as their intellectual journeys over the course of the following decades, to give a sense of what the larger story of communist internationalism in India was all about.
Yeah, so you do discuss these characters as woven in networks, but networks that, again, you said have contingency about them. But apart from that contingency, these networks, you say, are also centered around, I don't want to, like, the idea of Moscow or the site of Moscow. Like Moscow seems to be a force that gives direction to the institutions and the characters that you're talking about. So could you talk to us about Moscow as a sort of potential binding force that had these networks?
I'm very happy to. Moscow, sometimes I think we forget just how important Moscow is to our history. By our history, I mean South Asian history. And I would go so far as to suggest that Moscow is one of the most important capitals for the colonized world at large. When the Bolshevik Revolution breaks out in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution is not simply a revolution that overthrows the Tsar in what was then Russia. It was also an argument for not just like bringing about a global revolution. It was also a call at the same time for overthrowing empire. And part of the recognition there was that the empire, in other words, European empires, are linked to capitalism. And so empire and capitalism in that sense were two sides of the same coin. And so the Soviets set up a huge infrastructure of sorts. And now I'm really skipping ahead in terms of the story, but the Soviets set up a huge infrastructure that supported and patronized and sometimes directly funded movements across the colonized world against various imperialisms. And so Moscow, in that sense, after 1917, and specifically after the founding of the Communist International in 1919, it becomes a haven, a mecca of sorts, for revolutionaries across the world, including India, who are all going to Moscow in some ways, at least those who can, in the hope of finding a patron for their anti-colonial struggle. And that's why, and I devote my chapter to basically a few memoirs, and I try to understand how people understood Moscow. And Moscow is this really exciting space at a very exciting time when, as I said, colored peoples, colonized peoples from across the world are gathered together in the hope of igniting and a global revolution, and through that, winning the world. It's a global project. And so I emphasize the word global because part of what my book tries to do, it tries to give a reminder of sorts of just how important communism was to the larger story of decolonization. I think oftentimes, especially in nationalist histories, we tend to think of national liberation struggles as being isolated from one another. The story of Pakistan is told in isolation from the story of, let's say, another colonial country, not just India, but in, for example, Vietnam or China and so on. And so part of what I'm trying to suggest there is that national liberation struggles, especially through the communist lens, they are also linked struggles. And so one cannot understand the story of decolonization in the 20th century without also thinking of the hugely transformative and impactful role that international communism played in forcing an end to empire.
Thank you for that, Ali. So to add sort of more concreteness and detail to what you just said, could you give our audience a sense of what the entanglement of processes of decolonization, the construction of communist utopias might look like who goes to Moscow? Like, give us an example of and what that journey looks like and what that interaction looks like, please.
I'm kind of smiling because I'm thinking of many characters, and it's difficult to choose. I have a few favorites, I have to say. How about if I begin from the person who I begin the book from, who is a guy by the name of Nana Singh Dhoot. He is from what is now East Punjab, and he first, as a young man, he first lands up in Singapore as a laborer. And from there, he somehow finds work in Argentina. And it's in Argentina that he comes across an emissary from the Ghadar party who is there recruiting people for revolution in British India. And in the late 1920s, he is sufficiently inspired that he's in Rosario, Argentina, of all places, alongside other Indian laborers, all from Punjab. And, in the late 1920s, they decide to go to Moscow to play their role, as they see it, in the liberation of India from British rule. And so they land up first in Hamburg. It's a long journey, as you can imagine. And in Hamburg, the local communists, they try to smuggle them to Berlin. From there, and it's difficult at the time because the fascists in Germany are also they're increasing the strength and so on. So, and through there, they end up eventually in Moscow. And it's in Moscow where Nana Singh and his other, friends and compatriots, they first gain admission in what used to be a school for communist revolutionaries across the world. It used to be called the Communist University for the Toilers of the East. And the course varied from 1 or 2 years to 3, 4, or 5. And so they basically just enrolled in the university, which is a bit of a disappointment for them because they had presumed that that revolution was about the glory of war and battle and using guns and stuff, except that they were made to read books. There were guns too, but the Soviets also insisted on reading. So yeah, I mean, they basically graduated from that university and then they returned to India and set up and basically joined a nascent but developing communist movement back in the Punjab and in northern India. So those are some of the very ordinary examples that I'm interested in. And this is not really necessarily a story of those elite figures who dominated the communist movement or the national liberation movement. I very deliberately sought to explore the stories of those, the ordinary figures, if you will, who were basically driven by revolutionary dreams and revolutionary utopias. Because I'm primarily interested in thinking about, and this may be perhaps a more abstract point, but I'm interested primarily in thinking about a political subjectivity that is shaped by expectation, that is shaped by this realization of belonging to a particular moment, of a particular time, a time of change, a time of the now, a time of transformation, which I tried to kind of focus more on because much of the stories that we have of communism in South Asia and elsewhere indeed focuses centrally on the question of class formation, which is, of course, a very important part of the story. So it's a story that focuses, for example, entirely on economic conditions, and from there the link is that because people are economically disenfranchised or economically disadvantaged, that's one of the leading kind of motivators for people to join the movement of the left, whether it's a trade union movement or whether it's a communist movement, whatever. And all that obviously is true, but I try to think about what this time meant, what this moment meant, and this is a profoundly important moment in the sense that it's a moment in which there are incredible expectations and dreams about what a post-imperial world can and ought to look like. And there's a sense of certainty about it, which then kind of shapes political subjectivities and which kind of drives people often to suicidal lengths. And which is why this person, in as much as he comes from a low, not a low, but a small landholding family in the Punjab, finds, and working in Argentina, finds himself driven to go to Moscow. I mean, who would have thought that? And what was amazing to me was just how ordinary these stories were, because in our moment we tend to think of them as extraordinary stories. But for the moment, at the time, for Nana Singh Dhoot and his compatriots, there wasn't anything out of the ordinary in these journeys. In fact, it was what one did. And so that is part of what got me interested in this book. And so this is why I tried to trace this story through these characters.
So one way to make sense of what happened to folks, or what folks like Nana Singh engaged in, was that they somehow, through a complicated journey, end up in Moscow. They learn their communism, and then that gets
art of revolution.
The art of revolution.
It is an art.
Yeah, and then that art sort of gets imported to India, right? But that's clearly not what you're doing. In one of the chapters of the book, you talk about how it's important to pay sustained attention to what you refer to as regional expressions of leftist politics in colonial India, right? So it's not as if you go to Moscow, the center, you get your revolutionary goods, and you come back and you start selling those wares. That too would be it wouldn't be a great way to tell the story. So tell us about how the engagement with Moscow is an engagement, and what you discuss as local expressions of leftist politics aren't simply imports. So could you talk to us about that?
No, that's a great way of phrasing it, and I totally agree that not only would that be not a great way to frame the story, but if one were to frame the story like that, one would basically echo how the left is usually presented in official documents, both the colonial state and the post-colonial state. Because the left, if there's one thing that ties the colonial and the post-colonial together, and I'm making a very general point, but if there's one thing that that view, that ties a particular view together, it is that the left is a foreign import. That is somehow it is only through the patronization of a foreign power, in this case the Soviet Union, and later obviously China also came into the mix, but it's only through the patronizing of a foreign power that this movement can exist in South Asia. The other problem, of course, in framing the story in this way, well, first of all, it is inaccurate and misleading, and the second problem with that story is that it again positions the colonial world as the mere recipient of ideas that are fashioned and manufactured elsewhere, predominantly Europe. And so that kind of like really doubles down on this trope, this very racist trope that colonial peoples, that colonized peoples are incapable of creating kind of like theory and knowledge and improvising on ideas. And so that got me interested in the enormously rich and incredibly diverse expressions of communism in India. And just to kind of like focus on just to shape that story a bit more concretely, I tried to focus it on one region alone. And that allowed me to get like a really close-up view of what communism looked like, how it was understood on the ground, in the fields, in the cities, in the mohallas, in the bazaars of the Punjab, how it was articulated, how it was also, how it was also produced in terms of a theory. And South Asia, in as much as other colonial contexts, also was a huge part of developing communism as a body of thought. And I think sometimes we tend to forget that actually, if there is a region, very broadly speaking, where communism held like great sway and which produced communist thought, it's actually East Asia, and to some extent South Asia. I mean, I think sometimes there's a lot more focus on Western communism and Western Marxism, when actually Marxism and communism found very rich and fertile grounds in South and East Asia. And I think that's where a lot more focus of the global histories of communism and Marxism ought to be. And so this chapter that you referred to then tries to see, in some ways, how communism found purchase in what are otherwise, very remote kind of like towns, villages, and hamlets across northern India and specifically the Punjab, how it became part of a vocabulary of liberation, of resistance. And indeed, how it became also enmeshed in with a vocabulary or with an idiom that we would identify normatively as religious. It becomes part of a very localized vocabulary. It becomes part of it is in other words South Asian communism.
And could you again, for our audience, give us an example that sort of brings this to light?
I'm very happy to. So you have many examples. For example, the earliest examples that I can think of are basically arguments made by certain political activists who left India through the Hijrat movement, which is part of the larger Khilafat movement, and who, this is in the 1920s, who basically argued that there was no contradiction between the principles of Islam and what communism stood for, which, in other words, as they understood it, was egalitarianism. The same argument is made by those who were devout believers of Sikhism, and there are multiple references that one finds, for example, of how Baba Guru Nanak Badshaw was actually the first communist, and actually Lenin had been preceded by people like Nanak Badshaw and other kind of like religious divine figures. So this is just a very small example, if you will, right, of how communism basically was part and parcel of this landscape, which I think is always overlooked when it comes to thinking about the history of emancipation and liberation in this part of the world.
Thank you for that. So another sort of bad way of doing a history of communist internationalism or communist aspirations in colonial India might be that, hey, one, it's an import, and that's we've sort of discussed how it's not. It's the story is more complex, and the other is it's somehow siloed from, different from, protected from, or utterly defined against other sorts of movements, nationalist movements, communitarian movements that are also going on during the interwar period in colonial India. So, and you take good care to talk about how, when we're thinking about communism in India, in colonial India, you've got to, in the same breath, think about communitarianism, nationalism, and then there's an entanglement. I mean, in fact, the chapter where you talk about this is called Entangled Histories. So could you speak to our audience about that?
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing of what I tried to do. Thank you for asking that question, because I think as historians, specifically, and let's also think about the fact that we first learn our histories through nationalist historians. That's how we first encounter history, at least in school and so on. And there, I think, and from there, one can say, and this is also normally the case for many of the histories that I'm thinking of, even of the non-nationalist variety, that they are frequently told in isolation from other histories. So, for example, the history of the Congress movement or the nationalist movement, we very rarely have a sustained discussion on how that history of the Congress movement was also entangled with, let's say, in this case, the history of communist kind of like communist movements in British India. And so part of what my attempt is to show, well, two things really, that these siloed histories, they make very little sense when one looks at the context in which these ideas are circulating, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, when things are a lot more complicated. They also, by the way, echo the way that the colonial archive is itself organized, which compartmentalizes movements, ideas, personalities. And so part of what we risk doing when we silo these histories off from each other is that we simply echo colonialist, basically, forms of knowledge and the way that this landscape was understood and bureaucratized and basically bifurcated. And the other thing that I'm trying to show by arguing this is just to remind my readers of how vast and how disparate and how rich and embedded the idea of communism was. And so, which is why, again, there's a character who will try to tell the story through in this chapter, and his name is Darshan Singh, and he comes from a small village called Feruman outside of district Amritsar, or within district Amritsar. And so, this is the guy who basically, becomes politically active in the 1920s, and he is part of both the Akali movement, which is a Sikh religious/political movement, as well as being a member of the Kirti Kisan Party, which is a communist movement of workers and peasants. And he was part of many others at the time who had multiple political affiliations across ideologies, who saw no contradiction between their multiple affiliations and the multiple kind of both ideological and organizational, who pretty much saw their project as being one and the same. And so is that kind of richness, that entanglement, if you will, that I'm really interested in exploring. And because in some ways, when one thinks about the history of communism, especially in hindsight, it seems like a very doctrinaire, orthodox, ideologically rigid idea and movement, when that was rarely ever the case. It was a huge church. It was a huge umbrella, if you will, which incorporated many different ideological and political persuasions. So that is what I mean by, that's my gesture in some ways towards entangled histories. And part of what I'm trying to understand is how do these histories then diverge across the course of the following decades. So that's a separate point, but my attempt by and large is, as I've mentioned, is to think about how these histories are not really siloed off from each other, and B, how communism was profoundly embedded in a political landscape, and it could perfectly coexist and stand alongside other political and ideological persuasions, such that it was very difficult to tell where communism ended and where nationalism began, or where communism or where communitarianism ended and where communism began. So I'm interested in basically picking apart these otherwise rigid ideological distinctions when they didn't really exist in that same way.
And so one of the things you just mentioned was that if we think of sort of the history of communist movements in India as siloed from or separate from, let's say, nationalist concerns or communitarian concerns, we are in a sense echoing the colonial archive.
Yeah.
And here too, you in the book pay sustained attention to how the British Raj conceptually tried to make sense of these movements, how it's tried to manage them, to contain them, or to curtail them. So could you tell us a little bit about how the kind of siloing that might conceptually get practiced by historians of
Can I give a very concrete example of that?
Please, go ahead.
It may be a very basic example, but I think it serves the point.
Yeah.
So you pick up, for example, a regular police report from the 1930s, and you have various sections within that police report. The sections will go something like this: Mohammedan affairs, Congress affairs, Hindu affairs, Sikh affairs, and then there'll be a section on communism, and then there'll be a section on labor or something, and perhaps a section on students. So if someone is interested in charting a history, let's say, of Sikh political activism in the 20th century, chances are that person may also only read the section on Sikh affairs in that police report. But if you were to read the entire report from beginning to finish, you would notice that actually, hey, you know what? This person who comes up in the section on Sikh affairs, guess what? He's also coming up in the section on communism. He's also coming up in the section on Congress affairs and so on. And so, if you read across it, you'll figure out both, A, the logic of colonial, basically bifurcation and taxonomy, political taxonomy, I would put it like that, and actually what it conceals. And so, which is to say, it conceals this ideological capaciousness, this ideological expansiveness, that is pretty much the hallmark, as I see it, and that's part of my argument, in the 20s and 30s. When again, I mean, anything and everything seems possible when we think about questions of freedom, emancipation, decolonization, and communism is a huge part of that. But I think the other question that you're trying to get to, unless I'm mistaken, is how else does a colonial state view communism?
But before you get into that, could I build on
100%,
the example you just shared? You talked about how this sort of logic of taxonomizing what you're observing creates fractures where, like, if there's one person who's showing up in two places, it's as if the person's being fractured into compartments.
That's
one of the aims of your work, you say, is to recover the kind of, or to articulate the kind of ethical subjects the folks that you're writing about are. So could you speak a little bit to that, where the archive might want to fracture you into like 4 or 5 different parts of persons, that you are you don't appear the way you appear is fractured. So building on the police report.
Great question, man. So I'll think of the question of fracturing in 2 ways. The first, obviously, in the way that you mentioned it, which is fracturing in the sense of limiting the intellectual horizon, if you will, right? Or the political kind of horizon of that subject. But the other way that really kind of, that was a struggle for me to contend with was that the colonial archive, and one can understand why that's the case, but the colonial archive also flattens these figures out, which is to say that they appear only as fanatical, seditious subjects who are single-mindedly driven to sometimes suicidal ends to overthrow empire. There's nothing else. There's nothing more complex, in other words, about their lives. They come up at various points in time when they were of interest to the state, and then they fade away, which leaves a historian wondering, well, what else can be said about their lives, and how rich these lives must have been, which are otherwise flattened out in the thing that we call the police report. And so my attempt over here is again to build more rounded figures rather than flattened figures. Figures with rich lives, rich personalities, rich thoughts, complex, nuanced thoughts, and complex, nuanced ideas, complex, nuanced lives, more importantly. But also not to claim that I've overcome the archival limitation entirely. So I sometimes deliberately leave certain stories unfinished, because that's simply the archival limitation of what I'm working with. Sometimes the archive simply forces you to close off stories unfinished, and I leave it to the reader then to imagine what else those lives may have been, and how else those lives may have come to a close.
Could you share an example?
So, yeah, sure. I mean, so there are only a very few figures, for example, and I'll mention one of those figures, I guess, in a few minutes. But some of the figures that I look at in this book, they only come up with one chapter. They only come up if they're giving a political speech, for example, and then they fade away. And that's because I haven't really found anything else on them. And I would love to know more. But I don't make a claim, ultimately, that I can kind of like provide a biographical account of their lives. And that is also a gesture towards, in some ways, the power of the archive, and what the archive still exercises in terms of power by way of limiting the stories that we can't tell. So this is, in other words, to put it more succinctly, this is not simply a project of recovery, in as much as recovery and reparation is important. I think this is also a project that then, hopefully kind of like compels readers to think about the power of the archive and how it still has the power to shape certain stories that can be told and certain memories that can be resuscitated and so on. So recovery in that sense can never be, in as much as it can be an ambition, it can't ever be in that very same sense complete. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, thank you. And so building on that, how the British Raj, apart from apart from these police reports, if you could talk to the chapter called Red Scare.
Yeah, Red Scare, absolutely.
How it conceptualized. I mean, there's a bit. The title gives that away, but how it conceptualized communism, how it managed it, how it contained it by way of actors, institutions. Could you tell our audience about that?
It saw it as an existential threat. That's the shortest possible answer I can give. And it's not just India, because communism, as I said, since it is a key part of the story of decolonization, but what goes implied in that is that it's also the biggest threat to European imperialisms, and later on, of course, also American imperialism. And so, in the 20s and 30s especially, this is a colonial state that has to kind of like respond to and encounter a rising, what we call nationalist agitation and nationalist struggle. But it also has to contend with a emerging and developing and slowly strengthening communist movement. And communism, without a shadow of a doubt, beyond anything that the nationalist movement can throw at the colonial state, is seen as the existential threat to British interests in India. Because part of the reason is that it is suspected of being, rightly so, of being in touch and linked with the Soviet Union, which is, again, an existential threat to the British Empire. But also, the more interesting thing that I found, actually, at least in my reflection of it, was how communism was perceived and argued to be a foreign idea, an idea that was foreign to South Asia and to the subcontinent, as if this idea did not quite belong. And I think that is one of the most pernicious legacies of this argument. It's an argument that leftists in both India and Pakistan, but especially in Pakistan, always had to contend with. That this idea that you hold on to does not come from this land, does not belong to this land. And this is an idea that is inaugurated, in fact, by the colonial state. And it's an idea that finds its most forceful expression in a series of what were called conspiracy cases against communists, including the most famous one called the Meerut conspiracy case. It happens in the early 1930s. And there the colonial state is trying to outlaw communism as an idea. And not just like proscribe the movement, which they also do, but as an idea. And so, that to me says a lot more about how communism was kind of like addressed in India, aside from the usual way, which obviously, which I also kind of like chart, which is, through things like jail terms, through things like exiles and banishments, and basically what we used to be called nazarbandi, which was literally kind of like for jailing someone in the village, whatever. And so beyond coercive means, I'm interested ultimately in what the ideological argument against communism was, that is inaugurated by the colonial state, which is then picked up by the colonial state's successors in both India and Pakistan.
If I could just talk about the characterization of communism as foreign, if I could pick on that thread for a second.
Sure.
So, I mean, clearly the colonial state itself is, foreign.
Yep.
So do you find in the archive a sense of what might be legitimately foreign imports, and what might be illegitimate foreign imports in colonial India? So
Let me also point out that nationalism too, by that extension, is foreign.
Right. right.
Nationalism may be the most pernicious and the most foreign of all ideologies.
Right. So, but that's allowed to sort of...
Yeah, that was allowed to... So that was taken up in the colonized world. So, but beyond that...
But also allowed to circulate by the colonial state.
Exactly. Well, there's a complicated history there, because they're not quite okay with nationalist articulation either, because it's not anti-British.
But it's not received as perniciously as communism.
Exactly. But there's a lot... But to complicate that further, the natural unit, and by extension the idea that is considered to be natural to India, is basically the category of faith. And so it is natural, in other words, it's perfectly Indian, in other words, for Indians to organize along the lines of their religious community. Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, whatever. And faith ultimately is what binds all Indians together, despite the fact that that faith may be the cause of discord and divide and so on, which they also recognize and are actually perfectly fine with as well. Because part of this depiction of India basically is of a land of like warring kind of like, communities, including obviously most prominently Hindus and Muslims. And so that is held to be this natural kind of like idea that is properly Indian, if you will. Gotcha. That Indians ought to politically kind of, organize themselves around. Whereas communism, which focuses more on questions of class, does not really kind of belong in the same way. And one sees like echoes of that, as I said, even after decolonization.
Great. Thank you for that, Ali. So the last chapter of your book focuses on the moment and processes of decolonization. So could you tell us what happens to communist aspirations and dreams in that moment?
Yeah, that's a tragic story as well. Because in as much as we like to think of, and it was as well, of course, in as much as we like to think of liberation and freedom and decolonization as a triumph, I think it's also important to remember that it was utter devastation, and it was indeed a catastrophe. And by that, what I'm alluding to is a catastrophe of partition. And so, partition and the catastrophe that surrounded it in terms of mass killing and mass displacement was a negation of everything that communist revolutionaries had worked for throughout their lives. And so, in some ways, it is the demolition, if you will, of a dream, of basically seeing independence, this glorious story that they want to tell of basically a colony breaking free from imperial rule and a colony that overthrows capitalist kind of ties and capitalist logics. And so, in that sense, the communists, they find themselves being overwhelmed, if you will, by the rapid pace by which India was decolonized. And obviously, this divide that emerges most fiercely between the All India Muslim League and the All India National Congress. And so, in that sense, it was these are amongst other political actors that find themselves overwhelmed between these two kind of like forces. And so part of their attempt in the mid-1940s between the Congress and the Muslim League is basically to try and forge a united front with the two parties. And the hope is that this united front will not only allow India to combat what was then a huge danger, which was the threat of fascism, but also to come up with a united and concerted response to colonial rule. And this was one of the most prominent parties. By the 1940s, the Communist Party was the third largest party in India. In that sense, as though their attempt throughout was to forge a more united kind of like, political formation that included the Muslim League and the Congress, but for various reasons, beyond the control as well, that wasn't quite possible, and that didn't quite turn out to be the case. And that was at the larger All India level. But at the local level, you have plenty of stories of communists basically on both sides of the Punjab border, if you were to take that, of communists on both sides trying to kind of, intervene in communal, riots, trying to save, in many cases, other, their minorities in their districts or whatever. Some of them paid with their lives too. And one of the tragedies, of course, of partition, amongst many other tragedies, is that many communists who were Hindu and Sikh in what is now West Punjab were forced to migrate. Some of them were also killed. And so in that sense, it represents a huge setback for the dream. But that dream never quite faded away. And that's what I try to gesture to in the epilogue of my book, which is to say that in as much as this is a setback, communist parties on both sides, the left more broadly, on both sides of the Radcliffe line, they both were not satisfied with the kind of independence that India and Pakistan achieved. In fact, one of the slogans that united India and Pakistan, and communists specifically in India and Pakistan, was "Ye azadi jhooti hai." That this was not the freedom that they had fought all their lives for. Faiz, for example, most memorably conveys that in his poem when he writes about "Ye daagh ta khujala, ye shab guzida seher, ye wo seher to nahi jiski talash mein," and so on. And आखिर में जो फैज साहब जो जिस तरह से वो नज़म का इख्तिताम करते हैं कि चले चलो के वो मंजिल अभी नहीं आई, and that literally is quite simply how communists saw their task, which was that that formal independence may have been attained, but substantive independence lay further along the horizon. And so, which is why the left was a hugely important force in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and onwards in both India and Pakistan.
So picking up on that thread of how there's a distinction between formal independence and substantive independence, which I imagine is an idea that's circulating in India and Pakistan, in communist as well as other circles. Yep. Is there a character or is an example through which you could bring that to light?
I'm glad you asked that, because one of the people who I am still profoundly moved by is a figure who cuts across my entire book, more or less. His name is Amir Haider Khan. He is fondly called Dada, and I will refer to him as Dada. He is born in the year 1900, and when he is a young child, he runs away from home because he has an abusive stepfather, and he finds his way to Bombay, and that's when he finds work on board a shipping vessel, and then he sails the world twice, and then he lands up in 1917, 1918 in the United States, jumps ship. He basically then spends the next few years, tramping around, effectively. That's the word he uses. And then he finds work in Detroit. And this is someone who's from the Potohar Plateau, very small village. I mean, he's in Detroit. And so he kind of, and from there, he then goes to Moscow because he gets involved in the Communist Party of the USA. And he trains for a number of years in Moscow. He learns many languages, speaks Russian fluently. Again, this is someone who's come from a very small village in the Potohar region. And so from Moscow, he then goes to India, sets up shop there, does his activism, goes to jail, is jailed for more than a decade, actually. And when he comes out, he's from Pindi. He sets up, again, he goes back to Pindi. And when partition happens, and literally a few months after independence, something happens to Dada that he had been all too familiar with in the colonial state, which is to say that he's arrested. And he's arrested under the very same laws under which he was arrested in the colonial period. And so for the next, many years, in fact, for the next decades, this is someone who is seen as a threat by the Pakistani state. He is a renowned communist in both India and Pakistan, and they think of him as a seditious figure too, much like the colonial state. And so he spends some time in jail, and then he is forced into Nazarbandi. He's basically corralled off in his village in the Potohar, where he has to report to the police person every 3 or 4 times every week. And so this is someone who has given his life ultimately for freedom, for emancipation. And yet, these are the very same folks who are then picked up by the post-colonial state, who were seen again as a threat, and basically sent back to jail. Which then really raises the question of, well, who was this freedom really for? And if it wasn't for those who had fought their entire lives for the end of colonial rule and the emancipation of workers and peasants, then who was it really for? And Dada's story in that sense really encapsulates this tension neatly, in my view. And just to conclude the story of Dada, it's in the late 1980s. By that time, he has been to India once or twice, I think, and that's also the first time he's allowed a passport, because he's not even allowed to travel. This is someone who has traveled the world many times over as a young man. And the irony of his life in the post-colonial period is that he is bound to his village. And it's only in the 1980s that he first manages to go abroad, in this case India, and that's when he meets his former colleagues, his former comrades who were also from Bindi, and there's an emotional moment for him. But he doesn't live much longer than that. I mean, he's a huge figure in the local communist movement. But it's in the late 1980s that Dada, who by that time has a very fading and failing eyesight, he's practically blind, is run over by a truck. and he's injured critically. He spends a few days in the hospital, and it's only on his deathbed that the then Prime Minister, Benazir, she kind of like goes and visits him, which was the first, I suppose, official acknowledgement of the kind of life he had led. And he passes away soon afterwards. So, to me, his life, it's an incredible life. It's an amazing life. By no means can we think of this life only as a tragedy. It was a life full of all kinds of amazing kind of like achievements. But this is a life that, to me, ultimately tells, talks to this tension that you pointed out between substantive and formal, and ultimately raises a question over who this independence really was for.
Thank you for that. And as our last question, what's next for you? What are you thinking of? What projects?
Fascism. So that's my next project.
So 180.
180 totally. So as I said, I'm still interested in the vastly divergent worlds and worldviews and expectations and promises and hopes and dreams that went with this idea called freedom and independence. And I think we tend to forget just how important fascism was to the imagination of many political actors in India at that time as well. So, yeah, I guess in some ways it is a 180. I guess at some level it is a dystopian story as well. And I think dystopias are also an important part of the utopia of decolonization.
But are you also interested in exploring the idea of freedom as imagined?
100%. That's entirely what the project is all about.
So the thread of freedom as a theme continues in your work.
Absolutely.
You explore its place.
Absolutely. Freedom can also be dystopian.
Indeed.
So, yeah, I'm interested in dystopian worlds as well. So that is part of which are also obviously for them utopias. Right. Let's not forget that.
Right.
But that's the next project. It's on fascism and paramilitary violence in South Asia in the 20th century.
Great. Thanks so much, Ali.
Thank you for having me. This was an absolute pleasure and joy. Thank you.
Likewise.
For having me.